Today we're talking about all things hybrid. That's a big word that means a lot of things in about a lot of contexts. But we're just going to kind of talk about what the options are in a world where on-prem and cloud are mixed. So, Jeff, what kind of things come to mind when we start talking about hybrid?
It's another one of those terms that if you ask 10 people if 5 years ago you asked 10 people what cloud means, you get 10 different answers, right? Today
Right.
you ask 10 people what AI means, you get 10 different answers. And hybrid's kind of that same way. What does it really mean? And, to me, it just means finding that balance between what type of applications we still need to or run best on premise and which applications and resources run best in some type of cloud, whether that's SaaS or in an actual VM environment in AWS or Azure, whatever it might be. So there's a wide range there. Very few people are on-prem only these days. I can only think of maybe a handful, and those are tribal casinos that have to keep everything sovereign data on their sovereign land, and so they do not put anything in the cloud. And there's a few companies that, of course, over the last couple of years have been born in the cloud. They've never had an on-premise thing. But most clients live somewhere in between that, and that's probably what we'll talk about mostly today.
Yeah, almost every organization we work with has some level of cloud, right? And I mean, it started with like Exchange, right? Everybody used to have an Exchange server back in the small business server days. And once Office 365 came along, if you're still running Exchange on premise, you need to not be because it's a security nightmare and you're missing out on all those cloud features. And then we got Intune and Enter ID. And so now we've got this, your Active Directory is kind of extended into the cloud, or maybe it's all in the cloud. So lots of different things happening on that front. But I think what often comes to mind for people now is like, all right, I've got a couple servers on prem, and what are the things that trigger people to start thinking about moving into a hybrid solution for
Well,
that?
a lot of times it's a refresh cycle, right? We're running into quite a few now that you kind of get to that 6 or 7 years on hardware, and it just needs to be refreshed. And of course, 6 to 7 years ago, we weren't talking about Azure. We weren't
Right.
talking about even 365 practically. I mean, to a small amount, but so there was a lot of typical on-site virtualization that was still taking place. New hardware, everything went in, and now it's time, right? Now it's to look at it. And even people that were in a different point where they maybe could take advantage of the cloud because their business depended upon it, or there was some type of compelling work reason to do so. But for those that it wasn't a compelling an advantage, they just continued with what they're doing. And now it's that, take a look. Even 3 4 years ago, I would always say to people, hey, just because you can doesn't mean you should, right?
Right.
Just because you can move all this stuff to the cloud doesn't necessarily mean you should. In fact,
Oh
we're
yeah.
seeing even some rebounds now where people did put maybe everything into the cloud. Now they're looking at the cost, they're looking at other stuff, and it's like, oh, maybe we didn't need to put all that there, and bringing some of it back to on-prem. And it usually is cost reasons. I mean, there are
Mhm.
some type of things that, like if it's a machining shop and they've got CNC and they've got things that they have to connect to physically on site, that's a driver point. But for the most part, we're finding that sweet spot now between everything on-prem and everything in the cloud. There's this spot, and it's different for everybody where that spot's going to be.
Yeah, I think it surprises people when they come to us and they say, "Hey, we want to move all our stuff to Azure. We're moving our entire business to Azure." And you go, "Well, are you sure?" Like Azure's really good at like high availability or geographic availability or scalability. I got to scale it up and scale it down. But
Yeah.
if you've got a big SQL server you need for a line of business app,
Mhm.
running that in Azure is a substantial cost. The licensing and the horsepower needed for a SQL server needs a lot of cores and especially RAM. And all of a sudden you're paying the fees for all the licensing and the hosting and the disks, and it needs high performance disks. Before you know it, you're spending 2 or 3 grand a month on a SQL server. And maybe that's exactly right. You want it in the cloud, you want it scalable and available. So that's not a big deal for you to spend that money. But for a lot of businesses, you go back and you go, well, what's 3 grand a month for a year? That's 36 grand times 5 years. You can buy a lot of hardware for half of 150K, right? You split it out, and that hardware will perform better for the price. So there's a lot of variables to think through when you're thinking through what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I agree that it seems there has been this drive towards the cloud, which is okay, but that now that recognition of some of those costs, because maybe people didn't understand the when you're doing backups and you're doing restores, you've got all these egress charges and all of these things that don't come to play until it actually happens. And then you go, ooh, is that the right place? And so our audience for this particular podcast could be really wide, right? We've got clients that just have the typical, three hosts, two switches, and one SAN, and they've got that environment. And then we've got clients that have 1,500 VMs and can really use some of that ubiquitous. And we'll talk about that more towards the end of this. Of, where do we go from here with hybrid, right? Where do we start taking advantage of spikes and scaling as needed, but not incurring the cost to put everything in those environments? That's truly, to me, what hybrid means going forward. Because historically, hybrid meant, okay, I've got some hardware and I've got some cloud, or whatever that might mean. But now it's like, how do we get to the functionality of hybrid that makes sense? I think that the next driving point that people think of hybrid might be DR, right? I've got all my production on site where I can control it, or I just bought hardware 3 years ago. I don't need to throw that out the door. I get some more life out of it. But why am I paying for, hosting somewhere for some more hardware that's probably outdated? Because most people took their production, bought new stuff, and moved the old stuff to the data center to DR. So that hybrid is something that works, right? I mean, that's something that makes sense because there's this options now of archive storage, which is really cheap in Azure. And there's manufacturers that are building to that. They didn't build to it 4 years ago. 4 years
Right.
ago, they just stuck it somewhere. Now,
Yeah.
all these manufacturers and these software developers, they're developing purposefully to take advantage of the different price tiers in Azure and actually make it cost effective. So something, we were just talking about which workloads work best. Well, if you looked at something 4 years ago, maybe it didn't work best then. But
Right.
today, that same software manufacturer, I was thinking that I just went through a thing with Nutanix and how they can have this ubiquitous life between both the cloud
Yeah.
version and the on-prem for production. Yes, there still are smaller clients that might be listening on this particular podcast that just need to say, hey, Jeff, it's 7 years old now. Should I finally move this to Azure or should I refresh? And I just had a call yesterday with a manufacturing company that's actually kind of getting smaller. They're not getting bigger on-prem. And so it kind of makes sense to just keep the hardware and refresh the parts that they need rather than go to the cloud. But for me personally, what I'm getting more excited about is the manufacturers themselves, including Azure, including Microsoft, making Azure local and some things where, man, I can move workloads ubiquitously between the on-prem and the cloud. That's hybrid. That's the power of hybrid, rather than it just meaning what's on-prem versus what's in the cloud.
Yeah, I think that flexibility is just a real key game changer. So let's talk about like a common scenario. You get a Citrix farm where you get a lot of virtual machines or virtual desktops, or Azure virtual desktop, right? Where people are logging in to run line of business apps, and it's a desktop environment, the old school remote desktop kind of thing. Well, it used to be if you ran it on premise and you needed more servers, you might be out of hardware. Or if you're in the cloud and you need to get to your local applications, you'd have to kind of make the compromise of it all has to run through a VPN. And now whether it's Citrix or VMware or Nutanix, Azure Local with AVD, all these tools can be scaled to both. You can run AVD and have some of your users on-prem on Azure Virtual Desktop, but it's running on a server in your data center, super low latency, right next to your applications, right next to your hardware, your manufacturing floor. But then when you need to scale it up, you can throw them in the cloud, and you can have guys who need to be cloud only there, and you can do it dynamically and quickly and scale up, scale down, move VMs. Oh, I got a bunch of VMs on my VMware cluster, but I really need to set up a new local VM. Great, migrate a couple of those up to the cloud, to Azure through VMware's connection, and before you know it, you got bandwidth on your hardware cluster. So I think that flexibility,
Mm-hmm.
find the right, scalability or availability or cost effectiveness just really is dynamic now in a way that we couldn't do 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I really look at that when you say that 3, 4 years ago, I was pretty excited when Microsoft came out with Azure Stack, meaning that I can now take some hardware, run it on-prem, and And the concept was there. It didn't really work, but the concept was there that I could develop on-prem. I've got access to all of this stuff, and then I could promote that up to my VMs in the cloud. The
Mhm.
problem was that there was a very you had to have their exact hardware configuration, and some of those configurations, the smallest bundle was $400,000. Well,
Yes.
okay, there's very few. That's why they go, oh, it works great for the oil and gas industry. Yeah, but it doesn't work very well for the small, user that still has those flexibility needs. But now with Azure Local, and we're not doing a commercial for Azure Local. I'm just saying that it's finally
Totally.
got to the point where I can get a couple of servers, right? And I can now run it as my Azure admin center, and I can just pick those resources on-prem. But if that all of a sudden, maybe once a month, I run billing or I run something that's going to need more horsepower, it's going to need more thing, I can promote that to a VM in Azure in the cloud that has that, but I'm not paying for it forever. I'm just paying it for while I'm using it. And as we know, the meter's running. So that part of it now, the world and I think the technology is catching up with the concepts of what hybrid and what that flexibility should have been. So
Yeah.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah, and I think the other variable there is like that availability. Okay, so you've got on-prem resources, but maybe they're not mission critical, right? They're running on servers in your office. You got a server rack, you got an air conditioning unit, you got some decent power, but it's not a data center. It doesn't have redundant power or
Right.
redundant internet, right? It's not that level. And you go, well, for the majority of my workloads, if it's down for a couple hours because of a power internet outage, we're okay. But I have one mission critical app. It has to
Mhm.
be up. That server can't go down. And throw that thing into Azure and figure out all the load balancing and the availability groups and all that. And it's so much more cost effective than going and renting a rack and building all that hardware for that mission critical
Mhm.
thing. You get the full data center experience for a couple $100 a month if you need it. All the variables, all the bells and whistles, all the bandwidth and redundancy you can imagine in Azure, just with the click of the button. So there's just so much flexibility